3, 2, 1. Alrighty, friends, welcome back to the History with Tim podcast. Today we have Josh on, and we will be discussing the Israeli-Palestine conflict. God help us. But before we start, we're not taking sides. We're not making this political. We are discussing the history of the conflict. That's it. Josh, introduce yourself before we get...
Yep, so my name's Josh. I love history. It's fun. Obviously, this particular topic is maybe less fun than some other ones that I know you guys have discussed on this channel. But
discuss war.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But yeah, no, I'm interested to get started whenever we're good to go.
Well, we're good to go. How did this just go so dark? I went to the shadows. So a lot of people don't understand the whole Israeli-Palestine conflict. They are pretty much taking TikTok's opinion of it, which TikTok is a bunch of people younger than you and I looking at a paragraph of Wikipedia usually.
Yeah, you can't get the full picture of what's going on in a 15-second to 1-minute video. And to be clear, you're not going to get the full understanding of what's going on here, even though we will be discussing this for a significant period of time. So even before or while or after at any point, just go ahead, do some basic research whenever you want. There's a lot to learn on this conflict, like any other. But yeah, with that, let's get started.
All right. So when you and I were discussing how to go about this before we started, and I wanted to go as far back as Rome, and I agree with you that probably that's not necessary.
Yeah. So one of the things that people seem to misunderstand about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is it's really common that people see it as a sort of Jews versus Muslim conflict. And while it is Jews on one side of the conflict and Muslims on the other, that's not the core of the sort of start of how that became a problem in that region. They started really more from the geopolitical side of what Britain did after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire.
Well, this is where my history comes in, because the thing is, I say this about the Middle East all the time. The worst thing in the last 200 years that happened in the Middle East was the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, because pretty much the Ottomans came in and took what used to be Roman provinces that were in disarray and put them under Ottoman control, and they controlled them for a few thousand years. I have it up right here. Dissolution of the Ottoman Empire happens, and obviously it rises in 1299 and it collapses in during World War One. It is officially dissoluded in 1922, but that's thousands of years that it's one power governing this region.
One important thing to note about the conflict now versus the demographics that made up that region during the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, the demographics have changed quite a bit, but there were both Jews and Muslims living in the Ottoman Empire in that region at the time. And while you can make various statements on the equality of them within that country, it was the case that it was at least somewhat stable of a region.
Well, because the Ottomans followed the policy, which was actually very similar to the Romans. It's, you have your own governments, we'll let you run your own country, but at the end of the day, your taxes go to us, and your levies in the time of war come to us. So pretty much these countries were, in a weird way, governing themselves. It was like, a situation like Egypt, though, they usually chose the rich minority class to rule over the many, because the Mamelukes ruled Egypt, and the Mamelukes were the minority in Egypt compared to the Egyptians. Or in, what was another country they did that in? They did that in a few countries, that they put the minorities in charge over the majority. And, a place like Egypt that kind of backfires during the Napoleonic Wars, where the Egyptians welcome the French as liberators against the Mamelukes. But, was that a situation? Because Palestine, what was the province of Palestine in the Ottoman Empire, wasn't just what's today Israel, Gaza, and West Bank. It was more.
Right. So one of the important territories when it comes to when Britain eventually sort of divided up this sub-region into something closer resembling what we see today is the country of Jordan and Syria and what is now Israel and the territories of Palestine were all part of, if not the same, I guess, under the same province, they were all very closely tied together under the Ottoman Empire. And what we see is with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, when Britain, and this is getting further down the road, we'll get here eventually, but Britain sort of they made a lot of contradictory promises about what they were going to do with some of the land in that region. And I don't want to say they tried to honor them all, because, I mean, we're all familiar with Britain, reneging or forgetting about certain deals. But they did make several deals that they did follow through with, at least partially, or at least came up with, tried to follow through with several of their deals. And in the end, it wound up being nobody was happy. But that is, aside from the countries of, like, Israel and the Palestinian territories, the country of Jordan came about in pretty much through some of the same promises that Britain was making in that time frame.
Well, that's the whole reason Africa itself is so banged up the way it is, because of the way the Berlin Conference was handled. Because you're putting all these groups that don't like each other into the same regions, so now they're all, by a foreign occupation, being forced to be citizens of one region. Meanwhile, they're really not. They are all that's that could want to talk in modern sense. That's the whole reason Afghanistan is such a horrible country to try to occupy. They call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires, because the British tried to do it, the Russians tried to do it, and we tried to do it, and we completely failed, because you have so many different tribes and so many different cultures living in that country that the only thing they will unite over, because it's always Afghanistan, you can always initially invade and win.
But as far as holding the people, it's difficult when the people don't even agree with each other, let alone some outside occupying force.
Yeah, because now you're giving them that thing to agree with, to be like, we all hate these guys, so let's all work together. And then what do they do when the occupiers are gone? They go back to being like nocturnal. They mind their own business. They're nomadic. They stay away from each other. And that's that's something the British constantly messed up with. You can talk about the French with like Algiers and stuff. The French got what they got at the Berlin Conference.
Right.
The French, they really weren't. Bismarck was there. They were not in a position to be dictating things to him.
So, post World War I, Britain had control over these territories as the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. And as far as what was going to happen with these regions long term, as the British Empire at that time was still strong and going, there was not really a long term plan, World War I, for Britain to give up this territory. That came more along with the colonialism sentiment that came at the end of World War II. So in terms of World War I, that's important to know in how Britain ended up being the force that was sort of in charge of that region. And then post-World War II is more important here for understanding what the actual deals that got made were.
Yeah, well, because World War I pretty much the whole reason the anti-colonialism happened is because pretty much Roosevelt was like, enough. Where in a modern world we can't do this anymore. You and I actually earlier today were talking about how Churchill was furious with that, because Churchill didn't want to give up the British Empire. But it's a crazy thing, because at the end of World War I, England and France are still the superpowers of the world. They're the ones making the calls. In the dirties, the Munich conference, they're the ones that are talking to Italy and Germany about Czechoslovakia. But it's like, because of the Versailles Treaty, which we often say the Versailles Treaty caused more problems than it solved, they pretty much were like, we're just going to gobble up the colonies of all these former imperial territories, including the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungary, and Germany. And that's how a lot of these countries, like East Africa, Syria, Palestine, Israel, all these lands came into the British control. Egypt.
Yep. So we have this post World War II. We have the British controlling at least the regions of what is now modern day Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. And they made a bunch of promises as to who could end up with that land in the end of, like, after the war, reneging on several, as I'm sure everyone is aware. But what we ended up happening was, and this is sort of not the birthplace of the idea of the state of Israel, but the sort of start of possible foreign recognition, is you have the country of Jordan was assigned the territories of what is modern day Jordan and the West. Well, they weren't assigned the West Bank, but modern day Jordan. And then Britain didn't have a great solution for what was going to happen in the territories of Israel and Palestine. And the reason for that is because for years and years in Europe at this time, and in a sort to a lesser degree in the countries in North Africa and the Middle East, there was a big push by Zionists. These are people who believe that the Jews should have a state. There was a big push from them to try and create some sort of state in the land of Israel. Now, important to note, again, the country of Israel did not exist at this point. It was not referred to as Israel. But the reason that a lot of the push from Zionists wound up being to try and create a country in that land was because historically, and this is the, I think, total relevance of the Romans in modern day Israel, is that historically Jews came from the kingdom of Judea. So there's not really great. They didn't really have a great claim on any land in terms of their demographics at that time. So what you saw was a huge influx of immigrants from Europe and North Africa into Israel. They were all not happy with where they were living for, I think everyone can understand, obvious reasons.
Especially in Europe.
Facing great discrimination in Europe. And then as there was an influx of European Jews into the sort of Middle East, a lot of the countries that existed in the Middle East and the peoples they saw these as sort of foreign occupiers coming in to try and mess with,
a new form colonialism.
Right. So because they saw this as a new form of colonialism with the Jews moving in, Jews in the surrounding countries of Israel started facing more persecution than they had before, which only increased the amount, because it meant that all the Jews in that region started also flocking to Israel. And the thing is what they were doing in Israel was sort of a mixed bag. You had some groups just saying, oh, let's go move to the region. You had other people you had like militia groups, you had, paramilitary groups going around actually kicking people off of land. There was a whole mixed bag of both violence and people buying land peacefully. And actually, I want to talk very briefly on Jews buying land before the state of Israel was founded, because it's sort of an important thing to understand for how we got to where we are today, is that a lot of Palestinians will point out quite reasonably that they were kicked off of the land that they had been living on for generations by Jewish landowners who came to own that land. What's also important to point out from that is the way in which the Jewish landowners acquired this land legally. And that is, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire was more of a feudal system, and you didn't really see that come post World War II in most countries. There were very few feudal countries that existed. Yeah, Russia is like the big one that we can.
And that's why the revolution
point
happened.
out. But the key with a feudal system is that when you have the way feudal systems work is you have these landowners who have regular citizens living on the land, like the regular civilians living on the land that is privately owned by either the government or by some like aristocratic landowner. So what was happening was the Jewish people were buying small plots of land up from these aristocratic landowners legally, and on those land you had the Palestinian people living there, And the Jewish people who now owned the land didn't want the Palestinians living there. They wanted their Jewish relatives and friends and family to move in there so that they could have a stronger claim on the land. So that is sort of where one of the sort of original complaints of Palestinians being kicked off their land. I think it is important to note both, A, that this was done entirely, well, not entirely, because there were exceptions with, say, these paramilitary groups that were going around, but this was done largely legally, even if not morally. So that's one thing. The next thing is, so now you have a lot of Jews flocking into this region, and you have a sort of mixed demographics, but a lot of the Jews are sort of setting up in these settlements that are not in the same locations as a lot of the existing settlements. So again, there were whole bunch. There was no coordinated effort from the Jews to say, all right, this is the entirety of our plan. There was kind of, you had some people organizing and moving militarily. You had some people moving sort of with what they thought was a plan, but there was no overall sort of long-term plan of how the country of Israel was going to be founded, other than just moving there and claiming that it was founded, which led to a lot of complications. But England and Britain, more specifically, had a problem now because you have a lot of these Jews who are trying to form a country there, and they have also promised the formation of a Palestinian or Muslim state in that region. So they've promised some of these Jewish leaders that they would form a state, and some of these Muslim leaders that they would form a state for them. So what do you do? The answer for Britain was, I don't know, UN, help us out, right?
That's obviously not the best
Not
option,
the best option.
sadly.
So this is where we end up with the UN partition plan. Now, the UN partition plan, if you've heard of it, was basically a plan to divide the regions of Israel and Palestine into an Islamic and a Jewish state. Now, the thing is the UN partition plan never went into effect. So you might have seen these borders, and they sort of curve. They're actually quite interesting maps to look at in terms of the borders for what was planned, because they were divided by sort of demographic lines of where did you have primarily like Jewish people living there versus primarily Islamic people living there, and it almost looks like there's sort of this sliver in the middle of what would have been a Palestinian state of a Jewish state that is carved sort of down the middle. It's quite an interesting map. I highly recommend people look it up.
I'm looking at it right now.
But and there were various talks of what should happen with the city of Jerusalem, because for those who don't know, the city of Jerusalem is the holiest city in several of the Abrahamic religions. So the holiest site in Jerusalem for the Jews is, so the holiest site in the world for Jews is in Jerusalem, and likewise, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is one of, if not the holiest sites for Muslims.
Well, now, the holiest site for the Jews, would that be the wall?
Kind of. So the wall...
Because, and I just want to get the history about this first. The wall was built by Herod the Great, but it was also built as kind of... And this, I'm not trying to attack. This isn't me attacking. This is just from what I have understood from history. It was kind of a vanity project to kiss up to Mark Antony, because Mark Antony was technically the regional governor, because he ruled from Egypt and he was the regional governor. So that wall was because it didn't actually have what was his name?
Who was his name?
The walls, didn't the wall have a name, or the fortifications?
So the temple had a name.
Yeah, but wasn't it named after Mark Antony?
I don't remember.
I gotta look it up now.
Continue,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, while you're looking that up, as far as this is maybe the next, I guess, relevance of the Romans is that the Jewish Temple Mount had been destroyed and rebuilt several times, right? So the Jewish people don't actually know where the original temple in Jerusalem was. So the Western Wall is the only wall that's standing today from the temple that had been rebuilt several times. So it's not, the wall itself is not like the holiest Jewish site. The holiest Jewish site would be wherever the temple is, but it's not exactly clear where precisely that was because the Romans had torn it down and rebuilt this temple when they were in the region. Now, again, at the beginning, I stated that this was not a religious conflict, even though religion does play a part in it. And this is one of the I guess most important influences of religion, aside from the fact that both sides in this conflict are sort of just different religions, is that both sides found Jerusalem to be an important site to be within their country. Now, the UN partition plan had a sort of, what was basically a sloppy compromise. So you end up having Jerusalem not really being planned to be the capital of either country. And the Jews in Israel accepted this deal. They were happy with the formation. All they really wanted was a formation of their state and for it to be recognized.
So it was called the Antonia Fortress. That was what part of the wall was for, that Herod built kind of as a, hey, I'm on your side. Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure I want to make sure we hit that.
So the as far as the partition plan went, the Palestinian people did not accept the plan. They were not willing to sign into existence a Jewish state in that region. And this is where we get the sort of first war, which is called different things depending on who you ask. Israel will call it the War of Israeli Independence. I don't actually remember what the Israelis called it. Or, I'm sorry, what the Palestinians called it.
It's generally remembered as the first Arab-Israeli war.
Right.
It's in Israel. It's remembered as the independence, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So they. So this is we're getting into 1948. So if anyone ever, if you hear anyone talking about 1947 and the importance of that time or borders then, that is the time in which they're referring to the UN partition plan. So if anyone sort of erroneously claims to you we should go back to 1947 borders, just remember 1947 borders were never ratified by all the parties involved.
And very interesting, Bedouins actually fought for the Israelis, which is very fascinating because the Bedouins are Islamic nomads. They're actually one of the longest living groups in the Middle East. They actually were around during the time of not only the Romans, but they were all the way to Napoleon, and they were all the way to Napoleon III. That's actually why the French Foreign Legion song is called Les Bédouins, because that's who they generally fought, were the Bedouins.
Yeah, and they're still around in several countries, including Israel today, in like the Negev Desert and sort of in countries bordering that region. They're still around. They're going strong, living their best life.
Yeah, there's 220,000 Bedouins living in Israel, and 40,000 living in Palestine. Well, I guess that makes sense because probably the alliance between the two groups.
Yeah, so that so you have this this war that breaks out in 1948. Now, the start of this war is pretty controversial because of it being the start of a nation that did not exist prior, and all of the countries surrounding Israel were not in favor of Israel being founded. So you have several countries who were sort of gearing up to start a war, basically to stop the Israelis who had just claimed independence. So these you have the Arab League, right? So members of the Arab League, what you had Egypt, you had Syria.
I'll just list them for you.
Sure. Yeah,
I'm looking at it. So the Arab League was made up commanding not only Egypt, but they also commanded the Palestine Protectorate, as well as the Holy Army, which was I'm going to use this word, but it's not in what we know in a modern sense. It's more in the historical sense. The Jihadi Army, which would be like a Crusader army. It's not necessarily a country. It's not attached to any country. It's a culmination of countries, but in Islam it would be called a Jihadi Army. But it's called the Holy War Army here. Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Which, that's crazy to see Yemen and Saudi Arabia on the same side.
Yeah. Well, so I guess importantly, the Arab League at the time was sort of the driving political force in the region. So they got together, and Israel and the Arab League had a war. And in the end, Israel wound up winning that war despite the odds set against them. Now, there were a lot of there was a lot of displacement that went on during this war. And what's important to note is that as far as the borders at the end of the war in 48, is this was the establishment of the country of Israel. Because again, the Arab League didn't recognize Israel. Even after 48, most of the Arab League entirely, these were armistice lines that formed the borders of what was at the time Israel. But
they also took 60% of the land that was supposed to be allotted to the Palestinian governments as just occupation forces.
Right. So you have the formation of this state. You have Israel took a significant portion of land.
They pretty much had all of it and then gave it back.
Right. They took a lot of land that was not part of this UN partition plan. And their reasoning for it is the same reasoning for the formation of just about any country in history. Is they won it in war. And that's it. That's their land now. And the thing is it wasn't exactly a conquest, because there wasn't a country to conquer it until that point. But it was a country forming sort of from the ether.
Well, it's kind of like in Russia, they don't consider World War II, or the Second World War. They call it the Great War. What the frig do they call it? It's something the Great Patriotic War, because in their eyes the Allies weren't involved. It was them versus the Germans. So it's all, because even here, yes, it's called the Arab-Israeli War, but in Israel it's known as
the War of Israeli
Independence. The War of Independence. So because you have people like Goldie Mayor. Is that how you say her last name?
Mayor, yeah.
Mayor. She, that famous clip of her saying, she's like, I have a Palestinian passport because I was a Palestinian. A lot of these Jews that were fighting were already there. And to them, it wasn't a war of independence to fight and take the land. So I think that's interesting.
And then, so as far as what we're looking at borders after this war, the West Bank, I think this is an important sort of stopping point, so we can discuss what modern day Israel and Palestine look like, so that you guys have an understanding of why we're talking about specific territories when we are. Today, Israel consists of more territory than they had at 48. It consists of the territory they had that they had declared independence with in 48, plus up to the armistice lines in 48. Plus, they have the Golan Heights, which at this time was part of Syria. And they have the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as Palestine it's sort of under a military occupation. So the West Bank, at this point in time, after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War was not part of a Palestinian state, and neither was Gaza. What you had was Gaza was part of Egypt, and after this war, the West Bank was part of Transjordan. So interesting to note, the conception of this Palestinian state coming from prior to the Arab-Israeli War, coming from this UN partition plan. There was no Palestinian state then. There was simply Transjordan and Egypt. So even though the concept of the Palestinian state came from that era, that state itself did not exist in the way that it sort of does now.
You know, I'm sorry to divert, but this is actually kind of interesting because now I'm looking up Israel and like everything about that. The current president of Israel is the first president of Israel to actually be born in Israel. I think that's fascinating.
Oh yeah, and that sort of goes to show why one of the reasons why a lot of the Arab countries don't like Israel, in addition to their religious differences, is again they see the Israelis as being foreign sort of occupiers. Now, important to point out, a lot of the people in Israel are also from other Arab countries or from North African descent.
Yeah, I was about to say, because the guy before him was actually born in Palestine.
Yeah, so there are so it is kind of a I guess we'll say it's partially incorrect to say that Israelis are of European descent. There are a significant number of Israelis who are of European descent, with the second and third largest demographics in Jewish Israelis being Ashkenazi and Soviet Jews, respectively. But there are also a significant number of like North African Jews, for example.
Well, but this is actually, though, interesting because the United States, we're one of the few countries that don't actually allow anyone to be our head of state. Because, you and I were growing up when Nicolas Sarkozy was the president of France. Sarkozy was Hungarian. He wasn't even from France. Boris Johnson, true, he was English citizen and his father was an English ambassador, but he was born in Manhattan. We're one of the few countries that you have to be born and a citizen of this country first before anything. Another interesting thing about Isaac Herzog, his father was actually the 6th president of Israel.
Oh.
And he was born in Belfast, Ireland. So I think that's a little interesting as well.
Yeah. So you can see, even though the idea that Israel is a sort of European creation is not entirely true, it's not entirely unfounded either. Like, there is some merit to that idea.
But this is the other thing, too, that's a little different that I think us as Americans don't realize, and I didn't mean to go into this whole thing about the president of Israel because I just find that fascinating, but that's what this podcast is. It's supposed to just expand on those things. I don't think a lot of people realize the title of president in other countries is not the same thing as it is in the United States. Like, in the United States, our president is not only the head of state, he's the head of government.
Right.
Or she, or,
versus in a lot of these countries, they have a prime minister, they have some other head of government who is not the same person as the president.
So, like, someone, we're talking about Isaac Herzog as the president. Was it Herzog, or did I just really butcher this poor guy's name? No, Herzog. Isaac Herzog's the president, but everything we've been watching has not mentioned this man once. Well, maybe they have, because he's the head of state.
But for the most part, you at home have likely heard mostly of Netanyahu, who is the prime minister.
Yeah, and he's the head of government. That's like in Ireland, they don't have a prime minister, but they have a Taoiseach, which is just an Irish version of the prime minister. Or in England, they have Rishi Sunak, who's, King Charles is the head of state, but Rishi Sunak is the head of government. The only country, actually, that the president serves as the head of state and government that also does have a prime minister, ironically, is France. Because Macron is the head of state and government, but he does have a prime minister who works with him, which is very fascinating. But now that I'm done with that government discussion, continue, please. I'm sorry.
So we have Transjordan, we have Egypt. Now I think is a brief. We should take a brief moment to discuss the right of return. Now I don't know how much knowledge you have on the right of return.
None. That's why you're here.
So there's this concept called the right of return. I mentioned earlier that there were a lot of people who were displaced from their homes in this time, right? So the right of return is this idea that you or your descendants have the right to return to land that you were illegally kicked off of or sort of lost during war or something along those lines. So the right of return is a very important, thing to understand from the Palestinians' perspective, because from the War in 48, even before the War in 48 and onward, there was a lot of displacement of people living in that region, and a very common sort of put forth idea is that Palestinians today should have the right to return to their homes. Now, it's rather difficult to sort of ensure that that's happening today. Now we're dealing with like the descendants of. We're no longer dealing with the people who were kicked off, or even maybe the people's children. We're dealing with maybe their grandkids or their great-grandkids trying to move back to homes that have been either occupied by somebody else for a long period of time or don't even exist anymore. So this right of return is a sort of controversial idea when it applies to Israel-Palestine, because how long does someone have the right to return to their land? There's no good answer to that.
Well, and that's kind of like this idea of reparations in the United States. It's like, can you... And again, this isn't political. We're not being political. We're just stating comparisons between the two. That's like, there are some African Americans out there who are descended from slave masters, right. But there's also some white Americans who are descended from slaves. So
you have this weird idea or this weird sort of scenario where you have people who are objectively disadvantaged, and to use this analogy, disadvantaged in the U.S., for example, because they're descended from slaves. But how many generations past being descended from slaves in a country that admits that slavery was wrong?
It's the idea of are you punished because of the sins of the father, kind of thing.
So there's no. So I just want to make whatever your opinions at home, whatever your opinions are on how long the right of return lasts, or who has the right to return based on who was kicked out when. It's still just important to understand what that concept is, and that there is not a clear agreement among people around the world as to what the solution for, or how much the right of return covers.
Yeah, it's, and because that's something we've been seeing a lot, in what people have been saying. And, you and I have talked about this. It's very difficult. And, some of you who have watched my video, for example, on the Battle of the Pyramids with Napoleon, I brought this up very quick. It's very easy for us all to read an excerpt from a newspaper that's like, historical context. History is not black and white. That's the reality of the situation. If you want, you really want to go down to the bare bones, one of the first slave owners in the United States was a African man. One of the, you got to think about, there's a bigger picture here that we're looking at, and it's not, people were forced off their lands. Like you said, these were transactions that were done in 1920.
Right. Well, I guess the 30s was pretty common.
But like this can go into the Ukraine war too. Putin, when he initially sent peacekeeping troops into the Donbass region, he cited the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in World War I, which doesn't make sense because he said the Soviet government didn't have the right to do that because they weren't the legitimate government of Russia. But the legitimate government of Russia was on boats heading to England at that time. But, you're citing things that has generations have now passed, and the people involved in them have been dead very long. So where do you start making this distinction and making these decisions based on these things that happened back then? Like, you know,
right. And there's no real answer to that.
And I think that's where we come into a lot of these problems, is we are looking for the answers to a question that will never have an answer, sadly. Yeah. And that's just the reality situation. You know, it's like reparations here in the United States. How is that going to happen? How are you going to do it? You know, and, you know, we sit here and we have this discussion about the right to return, or even something like Northern Ireland. Like, is it possible to make a united Ireland? Yeah, but one side's going to be furious, one way or the other. Because honestly, the Southern Irish don't care. Like, there's definitely people, and I know I'm probably about to get attacked because I always root for Ireland because I'm Irish, but at the same time, the South doesn't care. They're living their lives. They're happy. The Northern Catholics are very upset, and the Northern Protestants are very upset. You have a scenario that if there's a unification, the Northern Catholics will be happy, but the Southern Catholics will not be. And if there is no unification, I mean, not the Southern Catholics, the Northern Protestants are happy. But if there is a unification, if there is no unification, the Northern Protestants are happy and the Northern Catholics are furious. So it's kind of this, you damned if you do, you damned if you don't kind of situation. You know, it's that like Jean Valjean moment of, do I admit who I am and go to jail, or do I lie and someone else has to suffer because of it? And, you know, sadly, there is no answer to these kind of questions. And, you know, I think we're facing that right now. And when people don't know what to do, that's when they get even more angry, and that's when violence erupts. And you and I, as history-minded people, and I would, to a point, say historians, we see that constantly with war. You know, we just saw Napoleon. Napoleon got furious. Why? Because he could do nothing about Russia trading with England. Because he knew his navy wasn't going to win, and he felt betrayed, and he was like, you know what? Screw it, war. I'm not going to negotiate. I'm done. War. Because we as humans that's our first mentality of, if we feel slighted, we punch back. And that's where we get ugly situations from.
Yeah. All right. So we left off post the war in 1948.
Yeah, right after there.
So continuing from there, you have the sort of start of political movements in the Palestinian territories to try and create a state for them. But what you don't have at this point in time is any sort of solid, I guess, leadership from the Palestinians trying to, like, working collectively with Palestinians to form a state. And I think if we want to skip sort of not quite a decade to the next sort of biggest event in the Israeli-Palestinian like history, we have, as much as the Suez Crisis was important to Israel,
the Suez Crisis, though, was a little more England and France.
The Suez Crisis was not as interesting as it was. It was not a significant development in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, the Suez Crisis, the quickest way to just make it is pretty much France and England couldn't declare war because they were members of the UN Security Council. So they had to get approval from the Security Council to declare war. But Anthony Eden was furious because Nasser took over Egypt and he took over the Suez. And he found a way around it because Israel was a young country and they did not hold seat on the Security Council. They could invade, and then France and England could send peacekeeping troops, which was an excuse for them to land boots on the ground.
Right.
And I don't want to degrade the IDF or anyone, but the reality is they were being used as the fall guys for England and France to have their war. And ironically, it was the United States and the Soviet Union that's like, you either stop or we invade all three of you.
Now, what the Suez Crisis is important for is to sort of set the stage for the Six-Day War. Now, the Six-Day War was massively important for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as you saw a lot of you saw a lot of development happening between sort of the Suez Crisis and now. Now, before the Six-Day War, I think one important thing to bring up is the creation of an organization called Fatah. Fatah was, I'm not sure if they were founded in the late 50s or the early 60s, but Fatah is a sort of political group / movement that founded with the idea of trying to create an Islamic State in the territories of Palestine. They are historically pro two-state solution. So basically what they're trying to do is create an Islamic State without necessarily getting rid of the state of Israel. Now, Fatah, at this point, they were sort of a mix of people who were... It's similar to the formation of Israel, how there was a mix of violence and people trying to sort of enact political change on the ground. Fatah was similar in that regard, although they maybe leaned a little bit more closer to violence than the Israelis did pre-48. Although there was definitely some similarities there on each side. So Fatah, I guess, is an important thing to bring up now because while they're founded now, they're going to become very important in the conflict going forward. So they're formed. We've mentioned them. We'll come back to them when we start talking about the Palestinian Authority. But back to the Six-Day War. So the Six-Day War, it's set up, basically leading into 1967, you have a few things that are setting Israel on edge. And what that is so you have the Suez Crisis, right? Egypt has UN peacekeeping troops in Egypt at that time, and you have a sort of understanding from Egypt that were they to close the Suez, that would be something important enough to Israel to go to war over.
It would be seen as an act of war.
Right. So what you have in 67, you have a lot of the states around Israel, a lot of the same ones that we talked about earlier, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, seemed like they were in a rather sort of gearing up for a war with Israel. More specifically, Egypt did a few things that led to Israel deciding that war was imminent. That was, one, they closed off the Suez Canal entirely, which again, Egypt knew that was a sort of issue that Israel was willing to go to war with. Two,
bold move.
Yeah, two, they kicked out the UN peacekeeping troops from Egypt. They said, all right, UN peacekeeping troops, get out of here. And historically, what that has meant is we're about to do something that the UN doesn't want us to do, i.e. prepping for war with Israel.
Weird side note, have you ever noticed the only place you ever do see UN peacekeeping troops is on the African continent?
Is that the case?
I've never seen peacekeepers...
Were they not in Europe at any point during the fall of what is it? Oh God.
I think so.
What was it, like the Baltic countries?
I think it was a coalition force. I don't think they were UN. I don't think Blue Helms were on the ground.
I'm just not familiar enough with where they've been.
Well, because then you could debatably say Korea was also UN, but that really wasn't. It was a coalition which the United States led that the UN sanctioned. But I think there's a difference between UN sanctioned and actual UN. Peacekeepers are the UN soldiers, pretty much. They're the guys that wear the blue helmets with UN letters on them.
Yeah.
I don't think so, because that's like Kosovo and stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean Kosovo. You have even prior to then, I guess Kosovo would be the most notable.
I don't think so. I don't think they had actual. I believe the Germans sent troops, and so did England, and we clearly sent troops. I don't think they sent actual UN peace. The UN army is not actually made up of any
Right.
big country. Like the Irish send, I think, like a brigade to fight for them, and Ireland only has 3 divisions. Well, divisions are different in each country. So if you're Irish, I just said that. I'm not making fun of your military. Like God knows I am one of the most proud Irish guys out there. But yeah, no, the UN, their military is usually made up of like smaller nations. Like they take like brigades and regiments from to be part of.
Yeah. So, point being said, UN kicked out of Egypt, and the third thing that Egypt did that sort of let the Israelis know that war was imminent was they started moving troops closer to the Israeli border, mobilizing troops. And at that point, Israel said, okay, well, Egypt's clearly gearing up for war with us. These other countries have all said they were going to support Egypt in a war with Israel. So we're going to get the jump on them. And this was the start of the Six-Day War. Now, Six-Day War, it's in the name, lasted 6 days.
Very self-explanatory.
And one of the reasons, so Israel preemptively launched strikes on several of its neighbors. And what they did that sort of led to one of the big reasons why they were able to win so decisively in the Six-Day War and so quickly was because they took out a lot of their neighbors' sort of their capacity to have an air force, basically.
Yeah, they targeted
They targeted the planes, the airfields, which meant that for the duration of the war, Israel had air superiority over all of their neighbors, which made it rather difficult for their neighbors to do anything about it. So you have Israel.
That's the point.
Yeah. So they attack. The countries were Jordan, Syria, and there were a number of other countries that got involved as well. But these were the 2 sort of main belligerents that Israel was concerned about. And in the end, Israel wins, and they see a notable increase in the territories that they are occupying. And this is where you have the start of Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. Now, me mentioning the Sinai just now, those of you who are familiar with geography but not with Israeli history might know that the Sinai is not part of Israel today. Not a part of Israel proper or a part of the territories they're occupying. And when I say the Sinai, I mean the entirety of the Sinai. So Israel had, at this point, occupied the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai, the Golan Heights. The other 3, Israel still has an occupation of. So, I guess to talk region by region, the Golan Heights was seen as important by Israel to occupy because of their sort of strategic placement over the lands in southern Lebanon and sort of, it's sort of southwestern Syria. You have these tunnels and these hills that give a sort of good military advantage there, and the population in that area is pretty small, so it was taken for the strategic advantage. The West Bank is a much more complicated territory in that so Israel began occupying the West Bank around the end of this war. Jordan previously, as we had discussed, had been occupying that region, just left. Now, with Jordan leaving the West Bank, there wasn't any clear path forward for what should happen with the West Bank.
Like a government or anything.
Right. It was really unclear because Israel established these sort of armistice lines that this sort of the green. So was the green line coming at the end of this war, or was that the Yom Kippur War? I think it was this war. But you establish this either way. You're establishing an armistice line for Israel, which sort of cuts out what we consider today to be the West Bank. And Israel was not given the authority to do whatever they want with the West Bank. But there was also no prior government that had authority to negotiate with in the West Bank other than Jordan, who had just given up the region entirely. So what do you do with this region as Israel? And the answer to what Israel did was they sat there and thought about what they should do with it, while some of their citizens started moving in and settling in the unoccupied regions in the West Bank. And when you hear about settlers today, these settlements and the expansion of these settlements are the ones in Israel that people are talking about. Is they're civilians and started moving into that area. And what happened is they were moving in illegally and without the authority of the Israeli government. But they weren't, even though they were moving in without the official recognition from their government, the military, the IDF, would sort of prevent any violence from, it would prevent them being removed from these places, these settlements that they were setting up, would stop them from being removed violently, which meant the people of the West Bank basically didn't have an option. They were kind of, it was weird because Israel officially didn't sanction these settlements, but sort of on the back end, their army was allowing it to happen.
So it was kind of like when, before the United States even existed, you had those settlers going into the Appalachians with militias, like state militias defending them, colonial militias defending them, and the British government sitting there like, excuse me? Which is also what caused the American Revolution. Yeah,
it was very similar. So you have Israelis moving into the West Bank because from their perspective, they just won this war, this territory in war. Meanwhile, you have their state who recognizes that this is territory that they're occupying, not territory that they have conquered. And that sets up a really awkward scenario that we're still dealing with today. And likewise, these settlements were happening in Gaza and in the Sinai. But there was a focus on the West Bank because the West Bank is, again, back to the religious, effects here, is seen as the land from old Judea. A lot of these sort of sites are more important to the more religious Jews in that region. So this is why sort of the West Bank settlements are the ones that both were and continue to be the focus of settlements.
Yeah, well, again, this is different in the fact that when we did it in the American Revolution, because, again, we were combating the Native American tribes that were living there. And debatably, that's very similar to what's happening here. But like you said, these were unoccupied territories, whereas you had people like Daniel Boone who were actually engaging with the tribes, and which is one of the reasons the English were getting angry, because they're like, we don't want people carrying British flags firing on these people because they weren't supposed to. But this definitely is what's bringing us up, because now we're getting very close to the Yom Kippur,
right,
with Goldie, and it's definitely setting. And like you said, we're still dealing with it to this day, but it's definitely setting everything up. It's like that scene in V for Vendetta when he's putting down all the dominoes.
Right,
it's pretty much V putting all the dominoes down, and then Yom Kippur is where finally he flicks it, and everything starts happening.
Yeah, so you have so now you have these territories that are occupied by Israel, which is a country that is seen more by the Palestinian people as aggressors than, say, Jordan, who had previously occupied the West Bank, or Egypt, who had previously...
Well, it's also a cultural thing.
Right.
Because this is completely different. And you and I have talked about this 1,000 times. some cultures just do not mesh well with Western cultures, and that's a big problem when you're doing stuff like this.
So this is where Fatah becomes important again, is that, or I guess becomes more important, is that to this point, the Palestinian people didn't have a sort of voice or representation in anything that was going on that represented the Palestinian people. Now, to be clear, Fatah did not and does not represent the Palestinian people on the whole. But this is sort of the time in which they became a lot more prevalent in their representation of the people of Palestine in sort of trying to establish a Palestinian state. Now that Israel is the occupying force, they sort of set themselves up as an opponent to Israel and to other, I guess, organizations that we'll get into later in trying to sort of represent the Palestinian people, because they had internal allies and still do, or sorry, not allies, enemies within Palestine, and they still do. So we'll get into that once that becomes a little more relevant to the history. But Fatah, so again, Fatah is their goal at this point is the establishment of a Palestinian state in that region. Israel, however, are a little more focused on their national security than they are on the formation of a state for the Palestinians.
Fatah only has 45 seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council.
That's today?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Fatah...
They're not doing so good.
We'll get there, but Fatah in the 90s... so in the 90s, there was the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which would become the official sort of body that Israel would negotiate with when trying to work with the Palestinian people. And the Palestinian Authority, Fatah controls the Palestinian Authority, or
well, it used to.
But so the problem is that if they were to hold an election now, they would not win that election, and that has been the case for I don't know 10 or 12 years. Hamas has since then grown in popularity in comparison to Fatah.
Because Hamas holds 74 seats.
So at the moment, Hamas holds more seats, but the Palestinian Authority is still represented by the leader of Fatah, despite Fatah having a minority in that region. Now, what's important to note as far as Hamas...
Yeah, let's discuss Hamas quick, because there are two distinctions, which... I know that's a debate because it's the same thing with Sinn Féin and the IRA, but there is a distinction. There are two Hamases in this.
So you have a political arm of Hamas, and you have the sort of militant wing of Hamas. We're discussing, when we're talking about the sort of parliament seats that they have in the Palestinian Authority, we're talking about the political wing. Now, they are tied to the militant wing. But they aren't they aren't exactly the same people.
They're not shooting orders off to them.
Right.
They're not directing them.
The group in Hamas is in the Gaza Strip today, when we're looking at, for example, the attacks on October 7th, are not directly held, they're not like under the
Ismail
group in the West Bank.
Ismail Haniyeh is not giving them orders.
Right. So, that said, Hamas, their political goals are still the same in each. And that is, Hamas came from a sort of, I guess, dissatisfaction with how Fatah and the Palestinian Authority was handling the conflict. And Hamas went a little more extreme in that they saw Fatah, who had some problems with corruption and problems with with actually making any progress for the Palestinians, and they said, all right, you're not making any progress with this two-state solution. We're going to be pro one-state solution. And Hamas, this is why you'll see a lot of people who will criticize specifically Hamas versus the Palestinians in general, is that Hamas is, they are for the dissolution of the State of Israel entirely, as they see the entirety of the State of Israel as one settlement. And this is why talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really hard with certain people, because the language around it is really complex in that if I say settlement, you don't necessarily know if I'm talking about the settlements in the West Bank, which is what I personally would be referring to if I brought up settlements, or if I'm talking about the state of Israel being a settlement from foreign people, which is what a lot of people in Hamas would refer to the state of Israel as.
Yeah.
So just be careful if you're ever talking with someone about this conflict. Know that a lot of the same terms can be used by different people to mean different things, which makes talking about it really complicated and difficult.
Well, and the other thing is, there's this movement of people who support like Hamas and everything like that, and I mean the political part again, not the militants or the terrorists, because if you look at a lot of the nations that do support the Hamas movement, it's countries like the Republic of Ireland, South Africa, Venezuela. It's all countries that used to be under the yoke of colonialism that are viewing what's happening to be similar to their situation. And to be honest, a lot of it is because it's the same country that had colonized them that had helped create the state of Israel. So on some level, it is a pettiness is the reason they're doing it. And I know that might come off a little hyperbolic and a little rough, but again, I'm not trying to get political, but when someone says something like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that is clearly calling for a one-state solution.
Right. So from the river to the sea, we're talking about from the Jordan River to... Are they talking the Mediterranean, which is the entirety of Israel? So from the river to the sea, it's a call for ethnic cleansing.
Well, I wouldn't...
Which, to be clear, a lot of people in the West who say that, they're not saying it because they understand that it is a call for ethnic cleansing. They're saying it because it sounds good, like it's what's it? Like the rhyme sounds good, yes. and freeing Palestine is a good idea. It's just the people who came up with that did not mean that in the way that a lot of sort of Westerners understand.
The other thing is, a lot of people, they're looking at this Jews versus Muslims. They're not looking at this as IDF versus Hamas. And this is a reality, and you watch my channel, I covered a lot of military, a lot of war. What's happening is horrible. It's been happening, and we haven't even touched the Yom Kippur War yet. But this has been happening since 1948. The reality of this situation is it's war. And who are the first casualties of war? The civilians, sadly. And that is why, if you look at a lot of historians, yes, we cover war, we talk about it a lot. It's because we don't want it anymore, because we do recognize the cost that it is. Again, we just saw Napoleon. One of the marshals, who I was able to tell who he was Marshal Nicolas Davout. Nicolas Davout was put in charge of the occupation of, I believe, Hamburg. When he went into Hamburg, there were 110,000 people living in Hamburg. When he left Hamburg, there were only 55,000 people living in Hamburg. And that wasn't because he was trying to kill people. It was because, at the end of the day, in his eyes, the military went before the people. So people starved, people died from they died from anything, and he had literally cut the population down to half. And that's just one city in the grand span. At the end of the movie, they give you the casualties in the Napoleonic Wars. It was like 4 million people died.
Is that a crazy number?
Yeah. Also, 30 years of war.
Right.
But at the same time, that's not all of that was military. And that's the reality of war. And yes, what's going on right now is a war. and it's awful and it's horrible and we disavow it, but that's what is going on. So Josh is going to continue with the Yom Kippur War. I'm going to...
Yeah, so before actually getting over to the Yom Kippur War, because there's a little bit more, I guess, background that's important, is the wars that we're going to be discussing, we're not covering every war or every military sort of conflict that happened in this region. So there was, for example, there was the War of Attrition, which happened pretty shortly after the Six-Day War. And this was a war that involved, again, a number of Israel's allies, but you saw the introduction, as I was just talking about, you saw the introduction of Palestinians who now have specific military and political representation. So in this case, you have the PLO, the Palestinian, or the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is largely headed by, but I don't recall if at the time it was entirely, it is sort of working with Fatah as this sort of military wing. So you have the long and the short of it is you have a lot of fighting that's going on here, not just during the wars that we're going to be covering, but in between them all as well. And a lot of these wars are, you have individual neighbors of Israel and or the PLO and or Fatah, and eventually, when we get closer to the modern day Hamas, fighting with Israel pretty much the entire time. But skipping a bit forward to the Yom Kippur War, I'm trying to remember. So the Yom Kippur War started as a sort of goal from the territory, the countries that lost territory during the Six-Day War, as a sort of attempt to reclaim that territory. So as we discussed, territories that lost or countries that lost territory during the Six-Day War, you had Jordan, you had Syria, and you had Egypt. Now, Jordan, interestingly, did not get involved in this war, as I think at this point they didn't want the West Bank back. They didn't want they didn't want to occupy that territory. But Syria wanted the Golan Heights back, and at this point, again, as we mentioned, Egypt has control, or does not have control over the Sinai, which is a large territory for Israel to have been occupying at that time.
Well, that's where all the wars in ancient times with Egypt were, because that's where the what are they, the Sicilians or whatever, the guys from the east that the Romans always had to fight. That's where they all were, and the Egyptians, the Sinai was pretty much their battlefield. They would just fight across it, but it was controlled by Egypt.
So the Yom Kippur War is named as such because Yom Kippur, which is a Jewish holiday, the attack was basically it was an attack led by Egypt and Syria around the close of Yom Kippur. Now, Jewish holidays, in terms of how long they last, are really weird, and it's hard to place certain dates on the holidays for it doesn't map exactly onto the sort of Gregorian calendar that we use. In that the Hebrew calendar is a lunar-based calendar, so nothing quite maps on date-wise.
It's more similar to the old Russian style calendar. Yeah.
So so there's no there's not a lot we can look back at Pearl Harbor, right? And that so that we know takes place on December 7th. Every year we can look back at that date and say this was the day that Pearl Harbor happened. And while you can say that for the Yom Kippur War, it gets a little confusing in that the Hebrew calendar Yom Kippur moves
it's like
when it happens every year.
Yeah.
Now, what I guess it doesn't really move on the Hebrew calendar, but the Hebrew calendar, how it maps onto our calendar, moves every year.
Yeah.
But that's a digression. So you have this Yom Kippur War. which was basically Egypt, Syria, Israel's neighbors upset at.
It was actually this is pretty wild.
You got the list?
I got the list, and this is an
interesting. You can go ahead and read the list.
So I'll read them off, and I'm going to tell you're probably going to guess where it gets weird. So Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, which is kind of far, but whatever. Jordan, Iraq, Libya, Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Cuba, and North Korea.
It's an interesting list of people.
See, interesting coalition.
Now, one thing I want to bring up in terms of, because we're talking about how Israel has won these wars up to this point, but what we haven't talked about is how they managed to get the equipment required to do so. And a lot of people understand now that Israel gets a lot of their weaponry from and by collaborating with the United States. That was not the case for most of Israel's history. So initially, in the original War of Independence / the Arab-Israeli War, they had to smuggle in weapons from, I think a large portion of the weapons they got was from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, it was actually Soviets. The Soviets were helping them.
Yeah, so the Soviets wound up, after the formation of Israel, being one of Israel's most important allies on the world stage. And this is, I guess, another politically interesting thing for Israel, although not necessarily too relevant to the Palestine-Israeli conflict, is that Israel began as the project. A lot of what was conceived in people's minds was a communist state. Now we know that didn't end up being what Israel would become, but that's just kind of an interesting thing to note when looking at the USSR supporting Israel in the 60s and 70s.
Well, you can also say that's also another way the Suez played into things, because the whole thing was Nasser, the president of Egypt during the Suez Crisis and the Six-Day War, he had actually gone to the Soviets because when they seized the canal, they expelled all the British, and the British were the only people who knew how to transverse the canal. But what they did was they actually went to the Soviets, and the Soviets sent them pilots to teach Egyptians how to do it. And when this attack happened during the Suez Crisis, I think that was one of the reasons the Soviets came out so strong, because I think they, on a level, felt betrayed because they had given so much help to the Israelis. And then I believe it was Gorbachev was the general secretary at the time. He was furious because not only were he attacking a territory that was in active negotiations with the Soviet Union, but he was also viewing it as Israel as being foot soldiers of the West, with France and England backing them. Which, again, is one of the few times you'll see Russian and Americans agreeing on something, because the Soviets and U.S. both threatened England and France if they didn't tell Israel to stop.
Yeah. So you have this war with all these countries again versus Israel, and similar to the previous wars, Israel shows that they are a military power to be reckoned with in that region, and they wind up winning this war started by Syria and Egypt in a rather short amount of time. Not as short as the Six-Day War, but it was a couple weeks.
Yeah, it was not long.
And it was a significant...
2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah. So it was a significant, I guess, in terms of the amount of people who were involved and who died in these wars, but territorially, the war itself did not change a whole lot. Now, after the Yom Kippur War, Israel would go on to give the Sinai back to Egypt, with the exception of Gaza. Gaza being the location that today causes Israel quite a bit of, I guess, headache. And we'll get into the Palestinians living there when we get closer to sort of modern times. But the Gaza Strip, similar to the West Bank, had at the time a lot of settlements from Israelis who had moved in there. And this is less important to today than the ones in the West Bank, since there are still settlements in the West Bank and there are not settlements in Gaza. But important to this time is that at this point, Israelis are living in Gaza, and therefore Israel decided not to give up that strip of land when they were giving the rest of the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. So I guess going forward from the Yom Kippur War, you have, and we're gonna gloss over a lot of these conflicts, but we
can't go with the details. Tomorrow is gonna when we do the Napoleon one, that's gonna be rough because I'm not talking about every single battle in a 30-year.
We're not talking about every conflict that Israel was a part of, but to give a sort of long and short of the next sort of decade and a half, you have fighting between Israel and the PLO, and you have fighting between Israel and Lebanon, and you have sort of support to Lebanon from some of these other countries. And by the end of the sort of, I guess we're looking at, as we're getting into the mid-'80s, we have what seems to be a fairly stable, in terms of territory, Israeli borders, based upon armistice lines set up in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. So there were no major territory changes, but as these settlements continued to build in the West Bank and in Gaza, you did see an increase in this violence coming from those regions towards Israelis, where you're seeing more and more what we might call terrorism. It's hard to distinguish because some of these settlers who go in and make settlements illegally, it's hard to call violence against them necessarily terrorism.
Well, that's why this is a very complicated situation, because some of this is sanctioned, but some of this isn't. So it's kind of that mentality of, do I have the right to defend my home?
So it's clear that some of this violence is justified, and some of it is not. Any of the violence against civilians who were living in Israel proper, unjustified. However, the violence against settlers who were coming in and displacing Palestinians from their land, that's a little harder to say is unjustified. And in fact, there are a number of cases, individual cases within those, that you could say is justified straight out. But either way, you're seeing an increase of sort of, I guess, what's the word? Unsettling, getting...
removals?
No, like the Palestinians being discontent. That's the word I was looking for.
Furious, angry.
You're seeing an increase in how discontent the Palestinians are, as nothing is really changing for them politically over this sort of decade and a half. And life for them under Israeli occupation slowly began to get worse, as Israel was not really incentivized to do anything to help these people. And them being violent towards Israel and Israelis in general made Israelis not want to help them. So it became this catch-22 where, okay, if we do nothing, our situation is not going to get better, but when we try to do something, our situation gets worse, right? And this is where we sort of get into something that more closely resembles the modern conflict, which is the First Intifada. Now, Intifada is a I believe it's an Arabic word that means something sort of like a shaking off, and it was a sort of the first large-scale uprising of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank towards...
Infidada, the translation is tremor, shivering, or shuddering.
Tremor, shivering, or shuddering. The idea being that you are trying to shrug off the Israelis who were living in that region.
This was a long one.
Yeah, so the Intifada it's not just one instance of violence. They are uprisings of the Palestinians causing violence to Israelis, and the problem with the Intifada is this is where we see an increase from the Palestinian side of violence against Israeli citizens, in addition to the violence that had been enacted on sort of settlers and the IDF. And so the Intifada is important from a perspective of understanding the increase of violence that was happening at these times, as they basically sort of are the peak violence of each time period that they happen in. So the first Intifada began in the late 80s and continued into the early 90s. And in the early 90s was where we start to see a lot of international pressure from the U.S., as by this point the U.S. is now allied with and working with Israel. This is where you start to see some pressure to internationally to try and make some sort of deal or arrangement between Israel and the Palestinians. So you have the Oslo Accords. Now, the Oslo Accords, at this point, Israel is in a sort of sticky situation, because while they would love to stop the violence that's going on, there's not a sort of Palestinian authority that they can negotiate with clearly. So you see the formation of this Palestinian Authority at the Oslo Accords, with the idea being that Israel needs somebody who they can interact with, to negotiate with, to try and lessen the violence that was happening. And Fatah is what you saw sort of the
step into
leadership within the Palestinian Authority. With that said, around this time, around the first Intifada, is also where you see the creation of Hamas. Hamas, as we discussed, being a little more pro the dissolution of the Israeli state. They're pro one-state solution, not two-state solution. So as we move forward from the Intifadas, Hamas will continue to sort of garner more support from people who previously had supported Fatah, but as they grow frustrated with Fatah's lack of perceived progress towards a solution, people will slowly begin to support Hamas more and more.
Do you believe on some level the reason Fatah finally said, let's sit down and negotiate with them, had to do with the fall of the Soviet Union? Because, I'm looking at Yasser Arafat right now. He's the first president of the authority. He was a hardline Soviet supporter up until the 90s. Why is that?
Well,
Soviet Union collapsed.
Right.
I talk about my brothers all the time. Like, it's crazy my brothers were alive and the Soviet Union still existed. But, which is crazy to think. That's 30 years ago. The Soviet Union was still around. But do you think that probably the idea that they no longer had a superpower backing them? Because if you think about it, this kind of was like a kind of Mujahideen situation. That, the Soviets were using their influence to influence the PLO, and the U.S. was using their influence to influence the Israelis. Do you think probably that had a lot to do with why they finally came to the negotiating table? Because they're like, we're not going to win now.
Yeah, so I've never personally thought about it in those terms, mostly because the support from regional powers to Palestine seems to have more of an effect on how successful they are than support from the USSR.
But you need money.
Right, yeah. But you need money. And while there is still and has been money flowing from these regional powers, you see a lot of money nowadays from Qatar and Iran. At that point in time, I would be curious to see if there was ever any sort of comments on that front that the USSR collapsing had, if it had a profound impact on them, because I'm not sure.
Well, it's very interesting because the USSR, much like Jacobin France, was an atheist nation. So the fact that they had their hands dealing with these two Abrahamic rooted religions, I think is very fascinating. But because while we're talking, I'm looking up these things because I want to know. And I'm seeing Yasser, and I'm seeing the amount of visits he did to the Soviet Union, along with other people like Nasser from Egypt.
Yeah.
These men, they knew, and you had countries like Cuba and North Korea that joined them in the Yom Kippur War. Why'd they join them? Because Russia wasn't going to send actual troops, so send the next best thing, their allies. I do find it interesting China didn't send anyone, but also at this time, China... Yeah,
so by now...
China also has negotiated with Nixon to open up by this point.
China and the USSR had a falling out a good bit before the actual collapse of the USSR.
Yeah.
But, I would be interested to look into further, because I've never looked at it through that lens.
It's just food for thought.
But I'm super curious about that now. That'll be something to look for. And maybe maybe those of you at home can sort of help us out and do a bit of research for us and let us know if you're familiar with any impact that the fall of the USSR may have had on the sort of willingness of Fatah to come to the negotiating table in the 90s.
Yeah, because I think that's very, looking at it and looking at his connections, because I often say I have the eyes of a hawk, and I'm observing this, and I'm like, this man is there's a lot of talk with the Soviets and the Russians here, and it's very interesting that it's under Clinton that he finally comes to the negotiation table. What happened before Clinton? USSR existed under George H.W., but it collapsed during that term too. So Clinton would be the next president, and it's kind of like when you get shot, you are alive for a few minutes because your heart's still pumping blood for 5 minutes. I wonder if, to a certain level, the help the Soviet Union finally just ran out after they collapsed, because they're like, okay, well, we're done. We have nothing else we can do at this point. Yeah. I food for thought. That's all
absolutely.
That's why I like doing it like this, because it's fluid and we can discuss it. And I thought that was very, because Yasser is how do you say his name? I feel like I'm gonna be criticized for this.
Honestly, I feel like I can read it better than I can.
Yasser Arafat.
Yeah, Yasser Arafat.
Yasser Arafat. He's definitely one of the more famous figures from this whole conflict. Like, he's the one that brokers the peace deals and the deals with the West.
Yeah, it's like him and Egypt's president during the 6 Day War was all. Yeah, Sadat was really important.
Who got murdered?
Yeah.
Who got murdered by his own people? That one.
Yeah, he was a rather important figure.
That was Carter too. That was before even Reagan. That peace deal, and he got gunned down. I think that's why a lot of these countries don't allow firearms in their parades anymore, because literally Sadat's assassin jumped from a formation with a fully automatic rifle and opened up into the president's booth.
Yeah, it's rough for him.
Real rough.
But so we look as we get into the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords they weren't particularly successful at accomplishing what they were trying to accomplish, which was a cessation of the violence. But what they did do, and why they are important to understand, or I guess one reason why they're important to understand, is they sort of set the precedent of how the West Bank would be treated going forward, in dividing it into these 3 zones, A, B, and C, with the idea being that you have zones that are under the Palestinian Authorities' control, and I say control because the West Bank is still considered under Israeli occupation, but the Palestinian Authority is given sort of the rights to develop on that land. Then you have another section of land that's set up that is technically under their control, but they're not allowed to do any development on that land. With the third region being one in which Israel has control of. And this is the territory where now, today, when you hear about expansion of settlements in the West Bank, this is the region that is happening within. So in terms of modern day Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Oslo Accords set the stage for how the West Bank would be subdivided, and it's partially one of the reasons why it's so hard to get to come up with a two-state solution. Is in addition to Israel, in order for Israel to agree to a two-state solution, they have to feel as if their national security is not going to be put at risk for the creation of an official Palestinian state. Now, in addition to that, Israel has this weird thing where they're unofficially not supporting expansion of settlements. Like, they say that they're not supposed to be, and they recognize that they're not supposed to be expanding settlements in the West Bank, but they allow the expansion of these settlements in the West Bank, and in addition to that, they back up the expansion of the infrastructure there with IDF forces. So it's like they're sort of talking out of both sides of their mouth on that front.
That's kind of not to compare Israel to Russia. That was like, early in the Donbass incidents back in 2014. Our generals aren't fighting Ukraine; they're on vacation.
Right, and this is why a lot of people will refer when they refer to Israel as an apartheid state. Personally, I find that statement to be hyperbolic. Now, by the technical definition of that, like the UN has set forth, it meets that definition. The reason why I find it hyperbolic is because when somebody brings up apartheid, they're bringing it up specifically because they're trying to compare it to apartheid South Africa. And Israel's situation, as bad as the expansion of the settlements into the military-occupied regions within the West Bank, as bad as that is, calling it apartheid is, and therefore calling to mind what was happening in South Africa, isn't really applicable, because the main difference being in South Africa you had two sort of different political classes within one country.
Yeah, you have the...
Versus in the West Bank, you don't have two political classes in one country. You have a country militarily occupying land that does not belong to them long term, and the creation of settlements in that militarily occupied land. And while that is a bad thing, it's not bad in the same way that the problems in South Africa.
Well, South Africa, they were going in and like beating people and attacking and executing, lynching for no reasons, just to make, this makes me, it's not technically apartheid, but like what the British did in India, I forgot what that massacre was called, where they asked the general, they're like, if you were able to get the tanks or armor guns through, what would you have done? And he was like, I would have used them. But they were shooting civilians. What those authorities did was substantially worse than what's going on right now.
Right, which is not to say that what's going on in Israel is acceptable.
Absolutely not.
The West Bank, the expansion of the settlements in the West Bank is ridiculous. Like, it's so crazy to me, because if Israel had managed, when these settlements first started getting built, if they had managed to stop the settlements from expanding then, and thus sort of keeping the West Bank separate from the civilian population in Israel, I feel like they would have a much easier time navigating the world stage nowadays, because that is one of the, consistently as we look at Israeli history, Israel acts in a way that is typically, and I am putting aside the settlements when I say this, moral in comparison to their neighbors. The problem is this settlements that they've set up is so obviously not moral that they lose a lot of their like credibility, where it would be a lot harder. So nowadays you'll see a lot of people argue that they support or that they a lot of people who basically, when they're supporting Palestine, some people will call them anti-Semitic. Now, they're not necessarily anti-Semitic. There's a lot of anti-Semitism within movements that are against the state of Israel, but there are also some rightful concerns to have with the state of Israel, and particularly what they're doing in the West Bank. And so quite a common phrase that you'll hear is, you might hear somebody say that they don't support, or that they're not anti-Israel, but they're anti-Zionist. This is, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the word Zionism.
Zionism literally...
Right.
Yeah.
So what Zionism is, and we're going to go on a sort of brief
Zionism
grammar
is
lesson
literally,
for a second.
it's first of all the movement that created the state of Israel.
Right. So the idea of Zionism is that there ought to be a Jewish state. Now, you could end there, but in the way that it's used, the word Zionism, it's clear that it has evolved to mean that Israel has a right to it. Basically, belief in the state of Israel, period. Now, that doesn't mean support of Israel in what they're doing in the West Bank, just the support of Israel's existence. So when people say that they're not anti-Jew, they're anti-Zionist, I think they're missing the mark of what they're trying to say.
But again, this goes back to what we were saying. People don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem with all of this, is people just don't know.
So my recommendation for people who find themselves wanting to say something like that is, instead of saying that you're anti-Zionist, but for like pro-Jew, if you are not against the dissolution of the state of Israel, it is easier for you to say, to just cut out any mention of whether or not Israel has a right to exist, and just say, I'm against the settlements in the West Bank. That's most people who are not intimately involved in the settlements of the West Bank, I have found, agree with that statement. And that's not a hard statement to disagree with. So you'll get more people on your side saying that than you would saying something along the lines of not being anti-Jew, just being anti-Zionist. Because people who are pro-Israel will hear that and will dismiss you as... It's kind of like how if you hear somebody say, I can't be racist, I have a black friend...
Yeah, it's actually the same exact thing.
People who are pro-Israel that is what they will hear when you say, I'm not I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. They will hear they'll hear exactly the same thing,
just
relating
in their
to their
version.
people.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind when discussing that with people who might have a different opinion. But as far as getting back to the history a little bit, we got to the first Intifada. Now, there were 2 or 3 of them, depending on how you count. The second one was in the early 2000s. So we move on to, this is where we start to see a rise in, not just a rise in Hamas's relevancy in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but where we start to see them taking sort of the lead from Fatah in the West, or in not in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip. There was a lot of violence going on in Gaza in this time, and yes, there was violence going on in the West Bank as well. But Hamas specifically is seeing a little more support in and this is the military wing of Hamas now is seeing more support in the Gaza Strip, as you have these sort of bombings that were going on from people in Gaza who were going into Jerusalem. I guess Jerusalem is probably one we should take a brief pause for, because we haven't mentioned how Jerusalem is broken down now.
Jerusalem has such a complicated history in itself.
For sure.
You know, you have to think Jerusalem was, which I'm not sure about this, but I know the Romans made it the administrative capital. Was it always the capital of Judea?
I think so. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe
because
it was.
I know the Romans usually did it wherever they saw the biggest population.
Right.
So that's why because, you know, Washington, D.C. is our capital, but I would say when the country was founded, Manhattan was our biggest population.
Right.
So that's why I'm curious. But Jerusalem, you know, goes from the Romans.
The thing with Jerusalem is Jerusalem was, like, back before the Romans wound up there, you had more of a tendency for these, like, city-states to exist, right? So Jerusalem and, like, the country of Judea started, or at least was rather, I guess, focused around the city of Jerusalem. And I'm not familiar with any city in Judea that was around then that is now.
What, Galilee?
Yeah, Galilee.
Wasn't that where Herod was? Herod's son, not Herod the Great, his heir. He ruled out of Galilee because the Romans took complete control of Jerusalem.
Yeah. So the thing with Jerusalem, massive history, and it's located in a part of the world that is sort of fundamental to, or at least involved in a lot of other like things that you might study. It's heavily involved in Roman culture. It was one location that Alexander the Great conquered. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was part of all of these sort of
even
large,
the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Yeah, the Kingdom of
Catholics
Jerusalem.
built.
You have all of these large, even the Persian Empire got into that region at one point.
Well, because they were Jews at Thermopylae that served in the Persian legions.
So Jerusalem is a fascinating city with a rich history of from various cultures and so much going on in that city, and is a really important part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, we've glossed over it so far, but when we talked about the sort of establishment of the West Bank's armistice lines, this line cut into the city of Jerusalem. So you have you'll hear the phrase East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem it's not a separate city called East Jerusalem. It's just the eastern part of Jerusalem that is part of the Palestinian territories, like part of the West Bank, versus the rest of the city of Jerusalem, which is part of Israel proper. And unlike a lot of the other territorial pushes that Israel made into, for example, the Golan Heights or the Sinai, the push into Jerusalem was a push made specifically to get that city. And to this day, that city is split, not in half, but it is split into regions where you don't necessarily have freedom of movement of people in East Jerusalem. But you also have it being the holiest city and a rather important sort of religious site for three large religions, for the two largest religions in the world, and for the Jews, who make up a large number of people living in that region as of the 6-Day War when they got into Jerusalem.
You put a parking garage where they crucified Jesus.
Good.
I wonder why Catholics had to turn to Rome, because we had to take St. Peter as the next best thing because you guys destroyed everything.
So Jerusalem is a sort of symbol for each side in terms of how important it is. Because again, like we've stressed, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is as much, if not more, a geopolitical conflict as a religious conflict. But it is a geopolitical conflict that follows religious lines. And that makes the sort of separation of the different parts of Jerusalem into a Palestinian side and an Israeli side a rather powerful motivator for each side, and a sort of firecracker in terms of where some of the violence can happen. You see a lot of violence, particularly around the Intifada, and we're talking about the Second Intifada, happening in Jerusalem, and obviously there's violence happening throughout the Palestinian territories, but when you're talking about violence in the Israeli territories, a decent amount of that was focused on the city of Jerusalem. And as we get sort of out of the Second Intifada, we get to a time when Israel is by this point starting to be more of, I guess, we have the establishment of what is nowadays the status quo in this conflict.
Well, also, just real quick, the Second Intifada...
Intifada.
Jesus. The Second Intifada is also... It occurs when 9/11 happens, too.
Yeah.
So they all kind of play a little bit into
early 2000s. Now, to be clear, the 9/11 happening during the Second Intifada is interesting, even though they didn't necessarily directly connect. And one of the reasons it is interesting is because I know we've only mentioned two of the sort of, I guess, Palestinian, groups that have been trying to establish a state of Palestine, an Islamic state of Palestine there. But there are a number of Islamic groups throughout the world, and a lot of them have had varying and both sort of supportive and simultaneously combative relationships with the Islamic groups in Israel. So, for example, Hezbollah is a group in sort of southern Lebanon. They right now control a good portion of southern Lebanon, and they have had a historically bad relationship with Israel. They don't like Israel. They think Israel shouldn't exist, similarly to how Hamas is pro one-state solution. However, their focus, Hezbollah's, the point of Hezbollah is not to get rid of Israel. They're trying to get control over Lebanon. I'm not very familiar with the state of I'm not very familiar with the state of Lebanon's history as much as I am with Israel and Palestine's. So I'm not entirely sure how Hezbollah was founded or how they continued to work towards their goals in Lebanon. But they are seen as a sort of aggressive force in Israel, and is one of the sort of points. So for people who aren't familiar with the region in the Golan Heights, and this would be the region of Israel that borders southern Lebanon, there are a lot of sort of yes, geographically you have these hills in the Golan Heights. That's why they're called heights. But you have a lot of tunnels and bunkers that are built there from a number of different wars that have fought there. And Hezbollah is the sort of, I guess, occupying force in that region that is agitating towards Israel. There's a lot of tunnels. There's not much in the way of, I guess, that you can really do that they can really do to one another, aside from the one thing that they still do often, which is shoot missiles at each other or rockets. And you have Israel, which gets involved in the war in Lebanon in 2006, where Hezbollah has a history basically of trying to agitate Israel whenever tensions seem to be rising in that area. So that's Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has a pretty, I guess, unique relationship with Hamas and Fatah, and that's one group, right? We've just discussed the very bare bones of Hezbollah and how they support kind of what Hamas is doing, but they don't necessarily. Sometimes they'll send direct actual help, but more often than not, they'll just sort of fire a few rockets into Israel and say, yes, we support what you're doing, and then leave it at that. So that's one group. But you have Hamas, for example, has a relationship with they had a relationship with ISIS. They had a relationship with their own relationship with Fatah. And Fatah and Hamas. Now I know as I've talked about them, I've put them on the Palestinian side each time. They don't get along, right? Hamas and Fatah are directly opposed to each other, in addition to a number of other Islamist groups, both within and without Israel. And interestingly, as far as Hamas's involvement in other countries, Hamas has been involved both in the assassination and attempted assassination of an Egyptian, prime minister and the king of Jordan. So
yeah,
Hamas. This is something Hamas has taken part in, but is not necessarily something that every group in the region has sort of been involved with. So all of what I just sort of went over to say that the number of factions and groups involved on the Palestinian side of this sort of, I guess, this conflict. There's so many factions. They all have varying
goals,
varying I guess methods and plans and how what they're trying to do, and involvement in both foreign and Palestinian specific regions. So all of this is to say that we're going to gloss over a large portion of the rest of the conflict, as the status quo having been, as we've already discussed, sort of the status quo that was established in the Oslo Accords, and we've sort of brought up the basics that you can understand, being the rising tensions between Israel and Palestine, being the Palestinians' lives, particularly those in Gaza now, though we haven't discussed why in particular Gaza is in a worse situation than the West Bank yet. We'll get there in a minute or two. But all of this to say is that their lives are very difficult, and because their lives are difficult, they tend to resort to violence, which is something that we obviously don't agree with. The violence itself, when portrayed when sort of enacted against civilians. And this is one of the dangerous, I guess, things to think about, is there are a lot of civilians who have both died and suffered on both sides of this conflict. But one thing I want to point out is that while the desire to sort of go to violence from the Palestinians is understandable. The violence against civilians, like targeting civilians, is not something that is acceptable.
Cowardly.
And the reason I think a lot of people don't understand the difference here, but it is rather important. Israel kills more Palestinians than Palestinians kill Israel. Those are the numbers.
Let's put this in the context.
Right.
The area they are attacking compared to what Hamas is attacking is much smaller, which is unfortunate, and we can discuss that.
Yeah, so Gaza is a very densely populated.
It's literally the size of Manhattan Island, pretty much.
Yeah, it's a small, densely populated. It's a city, basically. Well, it's a city and some surrounding area. But the thing is that Israel targets Hamas and or other sort of militant groups or what's the infrastructure.
Yeah.
So Israel and the IDF have a tendency to target military infrastructure. Now, here's the problem. A lot of the military infrastructure in Gaza is set up by Hamas deliberately in civilian centers. Meaning, Israel, every time they go to fire,
they know where they know it's gonna hit.
Israel, when they go to fire, do an airstrike on these military the infrastructure, has to. When they look at this, they know two things before they make this strike. First, if they don't make these airstrikes, then the airstrikes will continue to come towards them unchecked, right? So Israel has to do something to stop the airstrikes, or to stop the rockets that are coming from Gaza. And the preferred method of this is airstrikes on the military infrastructure. The problem is they also know that Hamas has set up this military infrastructure in a way that civilians will die if Israel opts to do those airstrikes. Now, Israel has decided that it values the life and safety of its own citizens over the life and safety over people who are they sort of are forced to engage with or get hit with rockets nonstop with no recourse. So make no mistake in that when we look at the number of deaths on each side, that Israel being more powerful and being forced to either just take it or kill civilians as a result of them targeting military locations is just going to be the case. However, Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza are in a catch-22 as well. So Israel, in my opinion, are pretty justified in firing at this military infrastructure, and it sucks because it means civilians are going to get caught in the crossfire, and they shouldn't have to be. But the instant you make something military infrastructure, you're making that a target, which means it is up to Hamas not structure their military like that.
Well, this is where we get into this discussion of war being war,
right?
Because this is the situation, at least with Israel, that at least, yes, they are targeting military things, and you could say, and it's true, Hamas has built a military tunnel system under Gaza that would put the Viet Congs to shame. But, we can't, and you and I have talked about this person that said this, about the whole thing with Dresden. We and the British during World War II firebombed Dresden in Germany and Tokyo. Neither had military significance. Neither they were finding bodies in Dresden up until the 50s because of what we did. So I'm not trying to say, oh well, at least they're trying not to hurt
Right.
people,
Like,
but it's a
not,
part of war.
It's not necessarily morally righteous, but it is justified, is what we're saying.
War is, sadly, a lot of people get hurt in war, and that's the nature of war. You know, like we said about Davout earlier. You know, the guy, did he want 55,000 people to die in Hamburg? No, not at all. But it unfortunately happened because of war, and that's always been the way it is. And at the end of the day, we're animals, and we find horrible ways to kill each other. But you know, can I say it's justified? No, I'm not. I'm not as connected to this situation. Even as an Irish American, a few years ago when Prince Philip died and the riots in Northern Ireland started again, I can't sit there and say, okay, it's okay that they're throwing fire bombs at the police in Ulster. But I can look at the situation from a third party as a historian and say that this is not new. This is nothing new. And I get in the modern sense we're supposed to be better people, but look what we did to Fallujah. Like, it's... We can sit here and try to act like we've done nothing wrong. You know, there's people that think the 40... What number was W? He was 41st, right?
Yes? No?
Yes, he was 41st because Obama's 42. A lot of people think the 41st president should have been tried for war crimes for what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, this is just the art of war, sadly, and it's always been the art of war. You know, we talk about Pershing in World War One. The war ended at 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918. Pershing ordered a straight-up mass frontal attack at 10:40, hoping to gain a little more ground. That not only he lost, but more Americans died than Germans. At the end of the day, history is sadly written by the victors, but no one's hands are clean, ever.
Now, I did mention that... the Palestinians and Hamas are also in a catch-22. And I'm going to get to sort of discuss this. It's a slightly different catch-22, as I think it's the building of the military infrastructure to have civilians like in that area is unacceptable. Hamas cannot be doing that. However, one thing to note is it's often pointed out that Hamas will target civilians, whereas the IDF targets this military infrastructure, and will condemn Hamas left and right about how Israel is targeting specifically military infrastructure, and that Hamas should also target military infrastructure. Now, the catch-22 that Hamas is in is they don't have the technology to target anything. The rockets that Hamas is sending into Israel are fairly simple in terms of technological capabilities. There's no guided missiles being sent from Gaza. There's no targeting going on. They just kind of aim it and fire, and that's it. And they just hope that it hits what they want it to hit. Now, as much as they can try their best to aim at military installations and infrastructure, they don't have the technical capabilities to do so. And with that said, as much as they should not be targeting civilians with their violence, when you look at the living conditions of the people in the Gaza Strip, and we'll get into that when we reach the sort of more modern times.
We're in the 2000s.
We're in the 2000s.
We're in the 2000s
getting there.
now.
We're getting there. We'll discuss the sort of Israel pulling out of Hamas, and then we can go over the modern conditions. But when you look at the modern conditions, they're really poor living conditions. They can't they can't get their own water. They need tons of aid in food, in any supplies that is going. Electricity, they have barely the ability. I mean, now they don't even have any electricity. But until several months ago, they only had the ability to produce a little bit of electricity, and they had to rely entirely on foreign aid. All of this to say that the violence that is coming from the Palestinians, as much as I can't condone the violence, especially that committed against civilians specifically, it is entirely understandable why they would resort to violence in that they don't really have much of a way forward without doing so. Now it sucks, and again, the catch-22 is the violence that they commit should be targeted towards military infrastructure, but they don't have the technology to target this infrastructure. Well, they're not allowed by Israel and Egypt, but Israel disallows the creation of these weapons.
Egypt doesn't want to get.
Yeah, Egypt doesn't want to get involved if they can avoid it.
Yeah.
So you see this catch-22 is
doesn't help your image.
Hamas and Palestine don't have the technology. They're not allowed to make the technology that would allow them to target military installations. But at the same time, they are condemned for not targeting the military infrastructure. So while they could scale back their targeting of civilians, and definitely should, i.e. the most recent conflict, the rockets specifically do put them in this odd scenario where you can understand why they would fire these rockets, and also they don't have the ability to actually target military infrastructure. So are they just supposed to sit there and have shitty lives, or should they be firing it makes the firing of the rockets a little muddier in terms of what is the morality there. It's unclear whether, obviously targeting civilians is wrong, but what do you do when you don't have a target, period?
Yeah.
And there's no good answer there either.
Well, how close are we now to October 7th, would you say?
So we're about 15 to 20 years away. We have one thing to discuss, I think, that's relevant before then, and that is to discuss the Israel-Hamas war in the 2000s, and specifically what's more important is what happened after that. As the violence in this region, once again, we see it in cycles where it kicks up and down and up and down. As it was kicking up again, and Hamas was becoming more and more militant in the Gaza Strip. Now, we mentioned earlier the settlements in both the West Bank and Gaza. And I mentioned briefly that there are no settlements in Gaza today, no Israeli settlements. That is because Israel, I don't know if you have what year they pulled out of Gaza entirely. Israel had pulled out of Gaza in, I believe it was the 2000s.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
So September 12, 2005, the last Israeli soldiers leave Gaza early Monday, ending 38 years of Israeli occupation.
So the Gaza Strip is not and has not been occupied by, well, today it's a little less. This is not necessarily the case. But going back, if we go back 2 months ago, from then all the way back to 2005, Israel has not had a presence specifically in the Gaza Strip. It has been run by Hamas and or the Palestinians in that area since then. Now, they are restricted in certain things by Israel, but Israel itself has not had settlements in that area. So that was the one thing that I wanted to sort of point out before we move on to the sort of modern day.
Yeah.
So today we're looking, it's November as we're recording this. And if we look back about a month and a half ago, on October 7th, there was an attack by Hamas on Israeli citizens, where there were thousands of people who were killed and or kidnapped throughout the sort of area surrounding the Gaza Strip, like in the nearby area. So this is, now you'll note that we haven't brought up numbers a lot as we've gone over history. That's because we were looking more at the history specifically than
Casualties.
what was currently going on. What's currently going on is the worst that the violence has been in at least since that Hamas-Israel war that we just mentioned in the 2000s. If not, the worst that the violence has been since the Second Intifada, which is quite a while ago.
Yeah.
So what we're dealing with now is basically Hamas committed what is to Israel the largest terror attack that their country has faced by targeting, killing a bunch of civilians, kidnapping, and bringing some of them back into Gaza. And this to Israel was sort of the last, not the last straw, because it wasn't a light
This was
thing.
now it's time to take the white gloves off.
Right. So Israel saw this as a sort of, I guess, it was a massive failure on Israeli intelligence's part, as Israeli intelligence is considered to be quite good at what they do. And while there were some reports about some violent act that was likely coming, the type of violence and the scale and the actual specifics on the attack were not sufficiently caught by Israeli intelligence.
Which is horrifying.
Yeah. So you have the modern conflict getting into where they are now. Israel, after this attack, is sick of... Basically, they're sick of Hamas, and that it sucks for the people of Gaza because they have been... So obviously, like I mentioned earlier, their life sucks, right? And a lot of the younger people in Gaza are brought up on a lot of propaganda that makes them believe that everything in their life that is wrong is the fault of every Israeli. Now, it's not the case that every Israeli is to blame for the suffering of every Palestinian, but it is the case that that the country of Israel has a lot to do with their suffering, right? But the sort of, as they're growing up, they're not taught the distinction that they should be fighting against the IDF or fighting against the Israeli government for more freedoms. They're taught that they should be fighting against Israelis, as they all don't belong there. Because I mentioned Hamas is a pro-one-state solution organization. They don't believe that the state of Israel should exist. So them having control over modern-day Gaza means that they sort of have control over what a lot of the children there are taught, which means that the children grow up learning these extreme, like believing strongly that the violence that they're committing is justified, and not just justified, but like righteous. And therefore they then teach that to their children, which makes it really hard for Israel to try and negotiate with them because they're seen as explicitly yes, they're seen as explicitly villainous in this way.
Well, and this, and to bring, we're in modern era now, but to bring us into history, the Jews have been persecuted for this for centuries. So it's very easy in Palestine to do this propaganda and then bring up propaganda, say, even as far back as the Middle Ages, to be like, see, even the Europeans think the same thing as us. And, when you're not educated and you're not taken care of and you're living in pretty much tighter than New York City conditions, it's very easy to be angry and be like, yes, it's their fault. It's all their fault. They're causing this.
Right. So just remember at home, civilians are not to blame for any of what's going on. And even the militants on the side of... So I guess a caveat for each side here. Israel does try to mostly target specifically military installations. And caveat for the Palestinians, they live in some of the worst living conditions on the planet. So understanding why they would want to commit violence is crucial, albeit the way in which they go about it is unacceptable. And that is what we saw on October 7th with the attack on numerous Israeli citizens and some non-citizens. There were people who were like foreign visitors. You had French, Germans, except Americans.
I think there were even Russians.
So that obviously it is unacceptable, both in my eyes morally, but in Israel's eyes militarily. They don't think that they don't want to allow something like this to happen again, which is why they have since then gone in to occupy Gaza again. And more specifically, they are doing a house-by-house run-through of the entirety of Gaza City. Gaza City being in the north of the Gaza Strip.
Which, as degrading and horrible that is, it's far better than what Netanyahu's alternative originally was. Because he originally, as we know, wanted to just...
Yeah, so one important thing to think about there is Israel has the ability, if they wanted. Now, perhaps their political standing would suffer enough to where they would never want to do this strictly for that, but they have the military power if they wanted to commit a genocide to do so. Obviously, they don't want to do that, both because their political standing would fall, and because Israel is a first world nation where most of its citizens are culturally fairly similar to countries in the first world, where they understand that genocide is, or even just ethnic cleansing is a massive like problem that should not happen under any circumstance. That said,
or in their name,
right?
Which is a big difference between first world countries and other nations. Is first world countries, the people speak out and say, "I don't want this done."
So even those people in Israel who would be for something like that, the majority of the citizenry are not for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Even though many of them are for the settlements that are going on, which contributes towards the sort of quasi-ethnic cleansing that is a problem there. The majority of the citizenry does not support that. Now, obviously, Palestine's a little more of a mixed bag in that the situation in Gaza is such that it's really hard to say what their I guess
opinions.
Because there are obviously Fatah still nominally controls the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but Hamas both just militarily controls what's going on in Gaza, and Hamas explicitly is for the removal of Jews from that region. So it's a big, it's a whole mess. But in terms of what's going on there, we'll see in the coming months how this develops. This is
definitely taking the more conservative, and I don't mean politically conservative. I mean like rational path forward, because again, we thought we were going to be seeing bombardments like Wilmington in the Civil War bombardments.
And to be clear, we are seeing a lot of violence in Gaza, right? But for the first time in a long time, Israel has sent boots on the ground into Gaza to actually go city block by city block to try and target specifically Hamas and other Islamist militant groups, rather than just trying to missile strike as they have done in the past. Now, how that will end, it's tough to say at this point, but it's clear Israel is not going to lose the war, provided that there is no substantial change in the parties that are involved. So, parties that are involved right now, the main parties being Israel and the several Islamist groups in the Gaza Strip, most notably Hamas, are the main parties that are involved. And there are a number of other parties that have kind of gotten involved, but don't have any militants on the ground, in the form of Hezbollah has fired some rockets at Israel, as have the Houthis in Yemen, and then Iran has spoken their support for the people in Gaza.
Probably bankrolled a lot of this.
Right, and then, however, the U.S. sent 2 aircraft carriers and a submarine to the region as a deterrent for Iran getting involved. So it's as it stands, it's a war that is taking place mostly within the Israeli-Palestinian borders, but has the potential to grow into something that is much larger should, for example, Iran do something to provoke the U.S. into joining. That is where the sort of danger of this ballooning up into a more regional conflict.
That's why I think it was very important that Netanyahu did not open fire into Gaza the way they were originally planning, because I think in that situation, the West Bank would have come forward and been like, no, that's insane. It would have been like, that's too extreme. And if the West Bank came forward, Iran, I am of the opinion would feel bolstered, especially with Hezbollah there over in Lebanon. And had they been bolstered, the United States would be bolstered. The United States is bolstered. That means all of our NATO allies would be bolstered. Our NATO allies are bolstered. We already have what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. So Russia and China would get bolstered to their side, and then boom, right there. That's literally, it's scary that you can actually, like I said about that V for Vendetta,
you can draw a straight line from one to the other.
It's that just, the V for Vendetta, the dominoes falling, you see everything happening, and you can call exactly how it will happen. It's literally just like World War I. The whole reason the Tsar mobilized the Russian army, he did not want to go to war originally. He was like, we'll mobilize the Russian army just to make sure that Austria sees we have teeth. But when he mobilized the Russian army, the Kaiser was like, okay, well, he's clearly getting ready for war then, if he's mobilizing the army. So that's what made him mobilize his army and declare war. And then France was honor-bound to defend Russia. And then Russia, and so on. And again, the British didn't get involved until Belgium got invaded. But you could literally see the ripples happen in time.
What's important to note is, so the United States has said specifically that they're only getting involved if some foreign power gets involved as well, right? Now, when I mentioned that Hezbollah and the Houthis have gotten involved, they don't have boots on the ground. They're not consistently involving themselves in it. They've just fired some missiles. They've fired some rockets, and then now I use the term missile. They're mostly firing rockets, but I don't know what the Houthis actually fired.
I think it was short range ordnance. It might have been long range ordnance, maybe, because I think they did hit some cities, but it was nothing. And that's the issue with the Iron Dome, is the Iron Dome is not built to deal with artillery.
The thing is the Iron Dome can deal with rockets, but historically the way that you could get something through the Iron Dome is primarily by just overloading it.
But artillery won't get picked up by the Iron Dome, because artillery doesn't go that high.
Yeah.
Artillery's just,
So these other parties that are getting involved. The point is that those other parties have other stuff that they're like doing, right? Like the Yemeni civil war. The Houthis have their hands full in Yemen, and yes, they have gotten involved with Israel, but they aren't like devoting.
It was much more of a symbolic move than an actual.
They're not
declaration.
like devoting all of their resources towards that. And likewise with Hezbollah, is they're not in control of Lebanon entire, and while they have fired into Israel, what they haven't done is put boots on the ground to enter Israel specifically. Now we'll see how this conflict is going to spell the next sort of era of what is going to be the new normal for this conflict. And it's interesting to think about because we've been in the state where Israel has had occupation of the West Bank and Gaza for a long time, and while they haven't been in Gaza for a while, I don't know if they're willing to let Gaza continue to operate how they have for the last 18 or so years. Now, after what happened on October 7th.
Well, the PLC is probably going to lose all, I would say in Gaza after this. Like the Palestinian Legislative Council.
Yeah,
they have no say when
they
happens.
didn't. Yeah, they only really had nominal say anyway because
Hamas
on the ground, Hamas
most
controlled pretty much all of Gaza.
Yeah.
So even though the Palestinian Authority had nominal recognition from Israel that they controlled or that they were in charge of Gaza and the West Bank, the reality on the ground was that was not the case.
Yeah. Well, that's, one of my favorite lines in a movie is in Cromwell where they're like, you're moving pieces of wood with paper flags that armies used to be.
Yeah.
That's kind of the same thing. Like you're giving orders and no one's it's like Hitler in the last few days. Like you're giving orders that you're sending to no one. There's no one there to take those orders.
And the point is now that the way in which this conflict is resolved, either by the inclusion in some other party, thus making the conflict balloon out into something larger, or if it continues as it has been and Israel just does what it wants in Gaza, and then who knows what their plan is after that, it will spell the sort of it will spell out what the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is going to be. We're going to learn once this sort of conflict comes to an end. Not this conflict, but the war that started on October 7th. As that comes to an end, we will have a better idea of what going forward is going to be the sort of next steps taken.
Yeah, it's crazy because we started this whole podcast, which we beat Nick again. We're a few minutes to beating Trinity, but this whole conflict starts in 1918, pretty much. If you really want to boil it down,
the whole conflict starts when you have Zionists moving into the region.
Yeah.
Post this sort of between World War I and World War II.
It's the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of the Turks, the Young Turks, and not the TV channel, the political party. And pretty much what happens in that scenario is instead of exhuming all the territory, the Young Turks just paid attention to Turkey and pretty much told these other territories, you're on your own. And whereas with the Germans and Austrians, Versailles, they made the decisions there, the British kind of just were like, well, we're going to move into these territories, we're going to take them. Like what they did in North Africa, the French were like, French Foreign Legion there, we'll move them in. But it's crazy because, we talk about how crazy things are with history. The Ottoman Empire was always going to fall. They were the sick man of Europe. Regardless of World War I, their fall was imminent. How different do we think this conflict would have been had they not fallen the way they had they just like fallen into like a democratic system.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big reasons why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict developed in the way that it did was because of these like contradictory promises that Britain made as to what they were going to do with the territory after World War II.
Yeah.
So if you have the Ottoman Empire, if it stuck around even just until World War II, you would have had history would have been entirely different in that region.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's impossible to say what that would have been, as the Zionist movement was happening, and because of I know we didn't even mention it to this point, but because of the Holocaust, the Zionist movement picked up massively.
Oh, huge support.
Come like the 40s. So the Zionist movement still would have existed, but if you had an Ottoman Empire until the end of World War II, who knows how the Zionist movement would have gone.
Considering we're at 2.5 hours at this point, and this is the first time we brought up the Holocaust the entire time, is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, if we're being honest, the Holocaust, as much as it was relevant to the foundation of Israel, in that it led to a higher number of Jews moving to what would become Israel at a faster rate, other than that importance, that and instilling the idea in Jewish people that they should have a state.
It definitely played into the world powers because they were horrified.
So that's like the entire relevance of the Holocaust to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in the creation of the state of Israel, in that the world supported that sort of thing happen. Not supported, but were more allowing of that happening on account of the Holocaust. And B, because the Zionist movement which had existed prior to the Holocaust, was shaped by the Holocaust as a sort of, demonstration to Jews to make them feel as if, okay, a lot of us thought that we needed a state before this. Now we know we need a state, so
because where do we go if this ever happens
right
again?
And the reason why this is interesting, the reason why the Zionist movement wound up being where it was specifically was because Jews didn't really have a good claim to any specific region demographically. There was not an area that was clear in terms of Jews being a majority in prior to them moving into the lands that are now Israel.
Well, because they are the tribe. They were always on the move.
They were very migratory. There were Jews all over sort of northern Africa and sort of Central and Eastern Europe.
Like the closest probably European would have probably been Poland and Ukraine. That's where I think the biggest of Jews were.
Obviously those populations of Jews got decimated immediately prior to the forming of Israel. So the reason why the Zionist movement wound up choosing the areas near Jerusalem was because they felt that was where the historical claim was strongest for them, because even though the demographics weren't quite majority Jewish in regions, which is why, again, harping back to the beginning of this podcast when we mentioned that UN partition plan map, that map followed demographic lines when it was made.
Yeah, because that's why I thought it looked so weird.
And it looked so weird because it's kind of following demographic lines at the time.
Because they didn't want a repeat of India.
Right.
Because India was bad. Between the Muslims and Hindus.
Did not... the Pakistan and what would become Bangladesh...
bad.
Oh man,
what happened? They were killing each other on the side of the streets because they were all being displaced.
Now, to be clear, some of that was happening in this scenario too. But I guess where this conversation was, it would have been really interesting to see, because the Zionist movement might have had. I don't know how that would have developed if the Ottoman Empire still existed when Zionists started moving into that region.
And you know what's so interesting? Because, the Ottoman Empire, it almost lasted as long as Rome. And we don't talk about it a lot. And it was a Western empire, if you really think about it. Turkey is part of Europe. So I've always thought that's very interesting that, we don't talk about it.
It is odd that we frame a lot of the Ottoman history, at least in what my learning of the Ottoman history was, in terms of its rivalry with the Byzantines and Rome. But really, it has its own massive hit, and it continued. Like, World War I is not that long ago. So the Ottoman Empire is, of the massive empires, one that persisted for, if not even the longest, just the closest to modern day.
The Ottoman Empire was founded in 1299 and it dissolved officially in 1922. That's
a long time.
That is a very long time. And their capital obviously moved a few times. I think it was even in Damascus at one point. Osman I is the first sultan of the empire, but obviously he's not the, a lot of people say the real founder of the Ottoman Empire was Salahuddin, because he was the one who started the process of expelling, which again, this is another fascinating thing. You go back to Salahuddin. Salahuddin didn't have a problem with Jews. He wanted to get rid of the Christians.
So this is I guess another important thing is people bring, when they talk about the Ottoman Empire and the Jews living there, because Jews did live in the Ottoman Empire prior and specifically a number of them did live in the area that would become Israel later. Jews were a minority there at the time, and they were. It's interesting because you'll hear debates of people talking about whether they were treated fairly or not under the Ottoman Empire. And here, the reality is that the Arab countries post Ottoman Empire dissolution treated Jews in their countries very poorly. However, during the Ottoman Empire, whatever the Ottomans had going on was at least somewhat stable. And while Jews and even Christians were treated differently than Muslims in that country, as the Ottomans
weren't suffering under pogroms like they were in Russia.
Right. So while they weren't necessarily treated ideally, they were being treated better than both they were at that time being treated in Europe and would later be treated in the Arab countries.
Yeah.
And then I guess as far as what is it? There was a little more sort of background that I realized I forgot to go over at any point. Obviously, there's so many things that we've skipped and glossed over. There's no way you can have in a conversation this even this long that you can have any level of significant detail.
It's definitely a subject.
Sorry.
No, it's this is all, we've talked about a lot in this, almost 3-hour one. This is now officially our longest podcast. We discussed a lot, and honestly, this is probably one of our more serious ones because we're touching a subject that is very controversial right now. But again, the reason it's controversial is because people are not having these discussions. And it's very important to have these discussions, especially about subjects like this that are, at the root of them, based in the history. Because at the end of the day, a kid born today in West Bank or Gaza and a kid today born in Israel, they're born without not knowing any of this. And they grow up depending on who's teaching them about it. And that's what's molding them into who they become. That's what molds that peaceful person or that violent person. And we need to understand the history of it. And the Ottoman Empire definitely, as we're talking about, the Ottoman Empire is a very important aspect of all of this. Because their fall is what makes all of this that much worse. Because now these Arab nations are free to do whatever they want. And, they're trying to mimic what the Ottomans did. But the Ottomans had a system that they knew what they were doing, whereas these new governments that are taking over are, and honestly, maybe this is why, because like I said earlier, the Ottomans were doing it with the minority classes ruling. But now the majority classes were taking over these countries, and they're like, well, how'd they do it? I don't understand how they did it. Because they expelled the minority classes. But it's definitely a subject, and as much as I'd like to keep going, we are hit almost at 3 hours.
Yeah, and there's so much more to be talked about in this. So if you guys have anything else that you'd like to see us sort of discuss in the comments, obviously feel free to ask any comments that you might have. Obviously, there are plenty of people who will disagree with some of the takes that we've had. Just please try to keep the conversation civil
and appropriate.
We don't want to promote any sort of disagreement is fine, but any sort of hatred towards any group here. Obviously, this is a very volatile subject, but that's not something that is sort of acceptable
and
in these
those
comments.
of you that follow the channel know I am very liberal with removing things if they're too inappropriate. I do not have the patience for it. We're here to teach, we're here to educate, we're here to have these discussions. We are not here to spread issues. I've done videos on the 12th Army of the Germans during World War II and what they did at the Elbe. I'm okay doing controversial subjects, but do not bring it into a place that I need to remove the comment. Because at the end of the day, this is history and we're trying to learn it, and things are not as black and white as we try to make them. But before we end, Josh, do you have any last things?
Yeah, I mean, the only last thing I'd say is that just know that we glossed over pretty much everything. So there's so much more on both sides of this conflict that we never got into. So feel free to do some research into that if you're historically minded. And other than that, just keep things simple.
Josh will probably be back on again. Thank you so much for joining us, friends. I hope you enjoyed. If you're new to the page, please like, share, comment. Again, I know this is controversial. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you in the next one.